Hey, I'm your host, Scott, Dr. GX Goldfine, welcoming you to another episode of Where'd You Get Your Funk From? For this episode, I'm delighted to welcome scholar Dr. Scot Brown, an historian of African American history, popular culture, and music. A lecturer, commentator, author, writer, and musician, producer, and songwriter, Professor Brown has been working on a book examining Dayton, Ohio's great 1970s funk bands. He's appeared as a subject matter expert in programs covering bands like Heatwave, the OJs, the Spinners, Ohio Players, Midnight Star, DJ Quik, Lakeside, Patrice Rushen, Mtume, and James Brown, and Bootsy Collins. Very impressive, Scott. How are you?
I'm great. Thanks. Good to be here with you.
Good to see you. Where are you today?
Right now I'm in my hometown, Rochester, New York, where I grew up.
Okay. I've been in Rochester for my, former day job. I went up there to go visit Bosch.
Mm-hmm.
So, and I also know it's like where Kodak used to be. I don't know if they're still there, but a lot of industry, well, some industry there.
Absolutely. And that was the magnet for a lot of folks who moved to Rochester. We had Kodak, Xerox, IBM, Bausch and Lomb. At one point, really had a lot of manufacturing jobs. Kind of makes the city, for me, kind of similar to Dayton, Ohio in that regard. And that's why I kind of bond so well with it.
And is it close to the Finger Lakes and nice scenery like that, or?
It is close to the Finger Lakes. I'm not so sure how many Rochesterians, make their way there. But yes, if you can get over to Canandaigua Lake and get over to like sort of a lot of the wine trails and things of that sort as you move, further towards central New York.
Okay. Do you get tired of people confusing it with Minneapolis or Minnesota, Rochester?
I don't. For whatever reason, I haven't had that happen too many times.
Okay. They didn't say, "Oh, you're from close to Prince" or something stupid.
No, I haven't. I haven't had that one yet.
Well, hey, Scott, it's great to connect like this. Been a fan, of your work for a long time as a mutual, funk connoisseur, enthusiast, supporter, all that good stuff. So thank you for doing this.
Thank you.
So the first question, the way I kick this off, is the title of the program, which is "Where'd You Get Your Funk From?" And it has two parts. The first part is, from a 30,000-foot view, how did you first get exposed to and get into the funk? We'll get deeper into it as we go. But initially, how did that happen? And then also, from that point, how did funk sort of inform who you are as a person?
It's so interesting because I remember the time when my mother brought me to visit a famous local artist named Stanley Duke. And it's 1974. So I was probably like 7 or 8 years old. And the song Fire, I love music and I was always buying 45s. And I didn't have the 45 to Fire, but Stanley Duke did. And he played that song. And he had just like back in the day when they had those very complex stereo systems, people had equalizers. So he had the greatest stereo system.
Hi-fi. Yeah.
Hi-fi, that's right. And then what he does is he saw how I was really into it. He kind of got a kick out of watching this kid really into this music. So he goes, "Hey, listen to it with these on." And he put a pair of headsets on me. And you know how you can hear all this stuff that's in the background that comes up to the fore with headphones. And I was like, wow, it was like going into another dimension of being, hearing all these sounds. And I love that song. And after that, I was converted. I wanted every Ohio Players album, much to the regret of my grandmother when she saw some of those album covers. But my aunt interfered and said, he just likes the music. He doesn't think about that. And so they let that slide. And I just became just a music enthusiast at that point. And the word funk was in there. Of course, if you start listening to P-Funk and these other groups, but I just knew that I loved the music of bands that were very popular all through the 1970s.
Yeah, I don't know if you know about how much you know about me, but Ohio Players was a band, my first favorite band, and Fire changed my world. I mean, that song was just unbelievable when it hit.
Yeah, it just had something that pulled you in, had that mean groove. It had these peaks and valleys, pour some water on me, as Sugarfoot said. So I was just into sound. By the time I got to be around 10 or 11, I expressed to my parents I wanted to play bass. And I remember my mom told me, "You don't really want to play bass. You just want to look cool." Well, she was right, but it was more both and as opposed to either or. And my uh, interest in bass was really cultivated by Rochester, like Dayton, Ohio, like Minneapolis, had a lot of bands, and some were uh, practicing right in my neighborhood. And so I was in awe of these groups. The big group in my hometown is called Chocolate City, the one that was in my neighborhood, and they could play fusion and do all these runs and all this stuff on, and they had a horn section, um, great vocalists. It was just an incredible experience. And they sounded so much like the record. And then they would do these vamps in between with all these runs that I was like blown away by. So I would listen to them practice. Two of my friends lived on that same block. They were more my age, but since they were influenced by them, they played really well already, like in 6th and 7th grade. And they ended up, Mike and Al ended up showing me a lot in the very, very beginning. Now, I wanted to play, I practiced, but for whatever reason, I had a hard time with timing and I had a hard time with ears hearing the notes. So oftentimes I played things by memory and I could be totally off and never know it, So I worked my way through that and I joined a group called Radiance, which became a pretty good local and regional band. We played a lot of nightclubs and we were underage, but you know how it is. We were able to work our way in there. Most of us were underage anyway. And we played nightclubs. We also got into the college circuit as well. Local promoters kind of pushed us, a lot of the SUNY schools and area colleges. And I joined that group when I was about 15. And we stayed together all through my high school years. And we opened for Millie Jackson. We opened for Frankie Beverly and Mays. And we opened for Kashif. Now we did all right with Millie Jackson, meaning that the crowd was sort of into us because we were a contrast. The problem came when we got overconfident and thought that we were going to, at least I did, I thought we were going to lay Frankie Beverly and Mays out, okay? Because who are these old guys, And so this is the year when the song I'll Do Anything for You was out, because that was one of the tunes we played. And so I had glitter in my hair. And I remember the bass player kept teasing me. He was like, "Hey, man, got something in your hair. Hey, man." And so that was kind of odd that they were poking fun at us because I thought we were the greatest thing ever. And let me tell you, part of it was that, opening acts tend to get experimented on by the sound crew. So we weren't really hitting like that sonically, but also we were playing cover tunes. I don't know if he came out. I don't know if Frankie Beverly and Mays came out with Joy and Pain, but whatever they came out with from the first note, from the first kick, it was a wrap. They were so much bigger and stronger, and the crowd went nuts. We were no longer even a factor. And so that was my first lesson in just thinking about elders, musicians, people who have been in the game a long time, what the difference is between being a kind of local artist and having a big name. So that was one of the experiences that I had in Rochester too. If you
May is, of course, one of the greatest live bands ever. So I mean,
yeah, we had no clue. We learned the hard way, Scott, about that part. The other element of being in Rochester was, and this is a couple of years before I joined the band, but a big part of my experience. So the big auditorium where major acts played was called the War Memorial, was downtown Rochester. The hotel that all of the artists stayed was the Holiday Inn downtown. And so I had because I was took the bus to school, I had a bus pass. So around 2:00, whenever we got out, I get on the bus downtown, and then I would transfer to my neighborhood where I lived. Well, whenever a concert went down, I saw the buses, the tour buses at the Holiday Inn. So every time there was a concert, I went to the Holiday Inn where I met Prince when he was the opening act for the Fire It Up tour in 1980. I was looking for Rick James, by the way. That's how up and coming Prince was.
You must have been looking closely because Prince is small.
He's small. And see, I came in the hotel demanding to find Rick James because I think I may have had a demo too. I was playing with a group called Pure Pleasure then. And I think I was trying to just see if, because Rick being from Buffalo, my feeling was that if we talk to Rick James, he's only an hour away. You know, I don't know anything about him going to Los Angeles and all that. I'm too young to understand that. So I said, where's Rick? Where's Rick? So I think it was a kind of security type of guy of the hotel walking around. He said, look, kid, Rick's not here. Okay. Rick James is not here. There goes that guy Prince, though, if you want to talk to him. And he was such an up and coming artist that he actually he was at the front desk talking with, there was no entourage working there for him to talk. He was there himself.
Yeah, that was like Dirty Mind era, or I Want to Be Your Lover era.
Album. No, it's the second album.
I Want to Be Your Lover. Yeah, okay.
I Want to Be Your Lover, the eponymous self-titled. Yeah, and so he's just coming out, and so I interrupted him and said, "Hey, Prince, can I get your autograph?" He had the hair parted down the middle, hanging, and all that. He had on clogs, and he had these shades with the mirrors on them. The kind of shades you can see yourself in when you're looking at someone. And so he just kind of looked at me for a long, I would say 20 seconds without saying anything. And then he begrudgingly signed an autograph. And I remember saying to myself, this guy's got an attitude, man. He's not Rick James, okay? That's how big Rick was in our minds, and how new Prince was.
How tall are you, Scott? How tall are you?
I'm 6'2".
Yeah, so you must have been towering over him.
I probably was a lot taller than him then. And so, I went to the concert too that night. A lot of those concerts were promoted by Al Heyman. And sometimes if he was around, if I, along with my friends, if we were running around the hotel or perceived as causing trouble, Mr. Heyman would say, kids, if you leave here, I'll get you in the concert for free. And we go back, get Al Heyman. And then eventually, after a lot of commotion, he would come out and he would let us in. He never let us backstage with the artists, but he would open the gate. It's open seating back in those days. And the floor was always packed with people standing up. And he just let us in. So I went to a lot of shows at a young age. I met Michael Jackson in the same circumstance, except he was trying to be in disguise. He was like a roadie holding all this equipment. And once I realized it was him, I think I very calmly yelled at the top of my lungs, "That's Michael Jackson!" And then everybody rushes to right in front of the elevators. So they were waiting to get on the elevator. Everybody rushes over, and Michael's security guard kind of pushed me back a little bit. And Michael was not having it. He said, don't do that. No. What do you want? I said, I want your autograph. He signed it, but you were not going to mess with Michael Jackson's fans. And so I went back to school with his autograph, and I was so proud of myself, and people were all looking at it, and that kind of a thing. So
Was
I had
one
to have
off the wall or before or after that?
right. Well, they toured. It was Off the Wall was the album out, but they toured as the Jacksons and was the Triumph tour, and they were wearing Civil War Union hats on that tour. I don't even. Yeah, I think it was even the Thriller album they toured as the Jacksons, the Victory tour, right? So and it was all. I remember that concert because when Michael Jackson was doing what I found out later was the moonwalk, I couldn't see the floor of the stage because people taller than me were in the front. So I thought there was a conveyor belt. Mm. I said, wow, that's really cool how they have that conveyor belt. He's just gliding like that. Because
moving sidewalk, yeah.
That's how it looked from the waist up. That's how incredible it was. I was blown away by how much he sounded exactly like the record. I mean, it was unreal. The precision, the moves, everything was there. Heartbreak Hotel was out, by the way. So that was really but Off the Wall, and it was still, booming on the charts. So that was my experience with Michael Jackson.
What happened to these autographs, Scott?
They're at my parents' house somewhere. I need to really do an archaeological dig up in that attic and find them, because I used to get a bunch. I used to get them all the time. Sometimes they were on like random sheets of paper, LTD and all these different groups that were coming to Rochester. So I know they're somewhere in a folder. The Prince concert and Rick James concert was interesting because I was used to big band funk, horn sections, percussionists. That was sort of like what I expected from most bands. And the Prince band made the stage look less filled. They had two keyboard players. I think it was Gail Chapman and Fink, the drummer, Bobby Z, bass player Andre Simone, and Des Dickerson. When they were the rest of the band members, when they were in the hotel early in the day, they looked like punk rockers. They had leather jackets that zipped up, and that was more like a rock band in my mind as a kid. I was, that was different. Now, they were really put on a great performance. The women were going crazy, especially when Prince dropped his pants and his G-string. I was too young to understand androgyny, so I'm like saying, hey, man, pull your pants up, man. What's wrong with you? But the women went crazy, especially when he played that ballad, Still Waiting, which is on that second album. Because that was radio then was interesting because Rochester's radio station, WDKX, Douglas King and X, DJs had the latitude to play anything they wanted, and they played B-sides, some of which were not even released as singles. And so you have songs that were huge hits in Rochester. I had no way of knowing that the whole world was not playing that song.
Well, you were lucky, though.
Yeah, that was, and I mean, it's still independently owned to this day. But that radio station played all kinds of stuff. And so I noticed the Prince show, obviously it was very impressionable. But Rick James came out with 2 column-sized simulated blunts, marijuana blunts.
Fired up tour?
Yes. And blowing out dry ice out the top of them. He had a skit where they'd have a conflict with a police officer at the beginning of the show. It was incredible. But I was also witnessing, Scott, the future of what would be dominant in the 80s and what was really going away that year, which is big band funk was declining, right? Horns were going to disappear and take a backseat to synthesizer. Prince being a one-man band was, pretty much ready for that trend because those lines he would do, were lines typically done by horns, right? And so that was interesting, but that was sort of, those were things were going on as I was also playing with bands. I was talking to artists, going to shows, and I was playing with bands at the same time.
Yeah. And it all coalesced into Scot Brown.
Yeah.
So tell us a little bit about then about how funk infused you in terms of your perspective, your tenacity, your like nothing's going to stop me attitude, like your free form, like funk, has that.
I expected that I would be with my band Radiance and then we would be going on tour by the time I graduated from high school. And, there were some conflicts in the group and it didn't work out, but I had been so committed to the group for so many years. And I had it's funny when people ask me, did you always know you'd be a professor? Absolutely not. I got talked into taking some part-time classes and I discovered that there was some transference between being a musician and the discipline, that you could also apply a lot of that to doing other things. I didn't know that. I discovered some things about myself by taking part-time classes, but the funk generated in me a sense of stick-to-itiveness. You've got to keep practicing. We practice in my group, the group I was in, I should say, we practiced 3 days a week. So studying for me was not a big leap from rehearsing and practicing my part in between rehearsals. So that was at the core of it. When I went to college and the movie Under the Cherry Moon came out, and I had to pick, when I was at University of Rochester undergrad, I had to pick a foreign language. And because I saw Prince and Tricky like really macking over there in France, I said, man, I'm going to study French. And that ended up becoming my minor. And that was a big part of my growth as well, because I studied abroad. I lived in France for a couple of years. And that's when I really got to see the international dimensions of the funk community. Because there's a whole group of, there's a band and P-Funk enthusiasts in a city called Rennes, where I was in 1990. And they loved anything P-Funk or George Clinton did, period. And I think they even won a prize at one point, a P-Funk contest prize. And so I hung around them and I saw George Clinton perform in Paris, actually with those guys. And there were DJs that were playing a lot of funk music as well. So that had a big impact on my sense of the breadth of funk. And when I came back to the United States, I kept listening to funk, but I stopped playing. And I really focused on academics. I stopped playing. I played in the gospel choir. And that was where really my ears and timing really just came out of nowhere, it seemed like. And I started writing songs. I wrote some songs with the band I was in before, but I didn't really pursue it that much during this period of time. Ended up going to graduate school. And when I'm working on my doctorate, it's interesting. I wrote a book on the group that started Holiday Kwanzaa. And I keep hearing people I interview mention this guy, Mtume, right? And I'm saying, I can't be the same Mtume, because I played with my band, the group I was in, Radiance, we played Would You Like to Fool Around? And we played Juicy. And I couldn't wrap my head around the idea that this person in this, super Black power organization in LA was the same person that I was playing in the band. So as time goes on, I start to realize that this is the same person. He's just got this incredible, diverse set of experiences. And around the time when New York Undercover was being scored by Mtume, I had gotten some footage somewhere of the US organization's Taifa dance troupe performing on the Rosie Greer show. And so it was Mtume playing congas on this show. So it was really almost like a dream. Somehow I got the number to New York Undercover, and I spoke to the gentleman. I said, I'd like to talk to, they were shooting in New York.
Well, I'm sorry to interrupt, but just so people know, that Rosie Greer show was what, like 72 or something? I mean, what year was that?
68.
68, wow.
Around 68, yeah. And so I had this footage. And so I talked to the staff person. I said, I'd like to speak with Mr. Mtume. He said, I can't give you his number, but I can connect you with his voicemail. And so I said, Mr. Mtume, my name's Scot Brown, grad student. I got footage of you on the Rosie Greer show. And blah, blah, blah. So hang up. I don't expect to hear anything. Within 15 minutes, hey, this is Mtume. What's happening? Said, you got what now? You know? And he became really an uncle, a mentor for the, you know, until he passed on. You know, he and I became very, very close. And I learned so much about just being an intellectual and being a musician. So the flipping point for me was around 1997 when I met him. One time I stayed over at his place in New Jersey in South Orange. I think I stayed there probably like 2 days interviewing him and just hanging out. And he said, brother, you've been with me this long and you haven't talked to me about music. You're talking about the history with the group. I said, well, you know, I kind of put that to the side a little bit and focus. And he said, that's a mistake. He said, never let your funk down. And I said, well, what do you mean? That sounded kind of generic at first, right? I said, well, what do you mean by that? That's, you know, he said, because life is a battle and you have somewhere to go. Most people don't have that place to go. You have a place to go to strengthen yourself for this battle called life. And he said, other people spend their whole life sometimes searching for that place and you haven't. So you're not going to be at your best. And my dissertation, which became my first book, Fighting for Us, if you look at it, you'll see it's not sequential. Like I moved the discussion about music and the arts to the last chapter because that's where I was. That's the direction I was going into. And I called that last chapter In the Face of Funk, the US organization and the arts of war. So I was making that transition. And that's when I started to say, you know, I got to merge my, you know, scholarship and research. I got to merge that with my passion somehow, and which is how I got into then starting to write about music.
That's fascinating, Scott. Thank you for sharing that.
Oh,
did you have parents or family members who were like, oh, he's finally, you know, going the way he should go, to like academia? You know, how did that go with them?
Oh yeah, they were so my everybody was so happy. Even my grandmother on my dad's side was happy. I was going to college. At one point, I flirted with the idea of going into the military, and my father, who was a Marine, talked me out of that, thankfully, I think, given the way things have turned out. But yes, everybody was like, okay, he's finally on the right path, because something about saying you're going to be a musician, going on tour, that kind of doesn't sound stable, right? And so, you know, you have people in your family that just want to see you have a stable path toward an income, et cetera. So the stereotypical musician is not seen as somebody, I mean, because the odds are so slim that you can make a career out of it. The interesting part of the story is that one of the musicians in the group, Rick Marcel is his stage name now, was our guitar player. He was always phenomenal. He plays with everybody, even plays with Kool and the Gang right now. But a lot of that Cash Money Records hip hop that they were doing, which have live instruments, he's playing guitar and bass, and he's cited as Rick the Man. So he's the one who really has a big professional career in music. Whereas with me, I kind of had to come back at it through academia, and I have all these other ways of participating in funk and the music that's not recording, but it's still extremely important and relevant and fulfilling. And then eventually, I start recording and putting music out. But we had at least one person who really, really, really became a big artist in that regard.
It makes total sense to me, that path that you described, just going with that passion and trying it out and then figuring, hey, I got to get serious about this, and then thinking you have to forget about that, but then realizing that, it's who you are and you can bring those things together and it's a beautiful thing. So
to this day, I hear people say, you always light up a different kind of way when you're talking about music. I don't even realize it. I could be doing a lecture on, the civil rights movement. But once I start talking about Curtis Mayfield, people say, wow, you really lit up once you start. And so you're right. It's about doing things that may not seem to others as conventional, but, and I still probably get some flack for it because there are some people that are more traditional academics that probably think me recording and doing these other things is sort of getting distracted. But I don't think I could write as well as a scholar about music, if I didn't play. So it sort of all works together.
Mm-hmm. And, you mentioned Chocolate City, from Rochester.
Mm-hmm.
And through talking to you, I also became aware of the Voltage Brothers.
Yes.
And, that track, Throwdown, is tight.
Yeah. And that was their big hit, and it gets back to what I was saying earlier. I had no idea that the Voltage Brothers were not top artists because their music was in such heavy rotation. Our worlds were so much smaller. Bigger then, in the sense that if you were in a city, you didn't really have a lot of contact with people far away. We didn't have unlimited long distance. Long distance was expensive on the phone. We didn't have the internet and all these things that connect the world. So I had no way of knowing if the Voltage Brothers were in heavy rotation. I expected that to be the case everywhere. And I think they actually, Throwdown actually did get played either on American Bandstand or Soul Train. I think it did get to that point, but they were a group called Funky Heavy when they were in Rochester, and they were a phenomenal band, another big horn band. I never got to see them as Funky Heavy. I saw them as the Voltage Brothers when they came. They were on tour. Throwdown was big, and they played a show in town. That's when I first got to see them, but they were amazing.
Mm. And of course, you mentioned early on Fire and the Ohio Players. So I got to ask you, did you get to see the Ohio Players in their heyday in the 70s as well?
Never got to see the Ohio Players because I sort of came of age in the late 70s. Now, I heard their music, but I wasn't concert, age. But the song Funkonauts was their last sort of big R&B hit, came out around 79. And it was really them almost utilizing some of the space themes, that you were hearing in P-Funk. And I thought the world of that song, but I didn't have the opportunity to ever see them live, except for like reruns or on Midnight Special, which I was able to stay up late. My parents would let me stay up late sometimes and watch, an episode of that, those late night music shows. I think it was Midnight Special and Don Kirshner's rock concert. Mm-hmm. Those were the two ways that I could see groups without having to go through trying to get into a concert.
Yeah, thank goodness for those shows. Because also before I became old enough, man, those shows, and then also starting it live, beginning some of them, like I discovered Gil Scott Heron, for example, on Saturday Night Live.
Wow.
So, yeah.
Wow.
Yeah.
Yeah. That was a really incredible age. And I know that every generation thinks they have the best music. But as far as this thing called the band is concerned, the self-contained band, the 70s was the decade, especially the latter part, where the self-contained band actually really dominated. I kind of have my own, not conspiracy theories, but I do think about the demise of the band in Black music as an industry imposed decision, as opposed to people's musical taste necessarily changing. So some people say, well, people weren't into that anymore. I'm like, well, why? If they weren't exposed, I mean, you can't choose without a choice, right? So I always kind of think about, why is it that MTV never captured the charisma of big band funk, but they go the extra mile for a Def Leppard or, a Duran Duran or NXS? Sometimes those groups are even playing funky things, right? But for whatever reason, there was a downsizing, sonically and also from a personnel standpoint. So like, I was a big fan of Cameo and the, Cameosis, Feel Me, Secret Omen, all of that. That was what I was really into. And so when they came out with, Alligator Woman and Be Yourself, that was hard for me to transition and accept. Now, they did end up becoming really, really impactful in the 80s, having made those adjustments, and they did translate something special into that decade. But from my perspective, I wanted to see the choreography. I wanted to see the horns. And even with Larry Blackman was behind the drum kit, singing and playing, and I just felt that was a more exciting experience, but it never made its way to video. And I think that had a lot to do with why the bands don't make it through the 80s unless you downsize your sound, or you're ready for that downsizing beforehand. Someone like Roger and Zapp, they were ready for it, right? But there are so many other groups that, even with Earth, Wind, and Fire, I mean, their last hit is with horns is 1980, right? Let's Groove Tonight. That's one of the last big horn songs of that period. So, I was really troubled by that because I had started so early in music. I didn't really accept those changes very easily.
It was horrific for me, but a lot of things conspired, I think, Scott, around that time. It was the anti-disco backlash, and lumping it in with that. And that, lack of understanding of how different it was from disco. And then I think there's a racial component.
Yeah.
And I think that there's a corporate, it became corporatized, the whole industry. And just all these things conspired. And then I feel like, the fan base didn't do enough to also make a stink about it, and
right.
demand, they kind of went with the flow too much. And
that's true. And, yeah, you're right, Scott. And I think that another part of it is that funk never got designated as a genre like in Billboard. It was there. It's a spirit. It's a vibe. But we never built institutions around it. So let's just say like country music, for instance. Even when they don't have necessarily the big hits, there's a community that tries to protect it and keep it going. And funk really we sort of took it for granted, if you will, that it would be here, right? And that's just part of what conspired, I think, to move bands out, was the lack of a real constituent community. Whereas, even from the beginning, in part because it's very regional, goes national, hip hop, they have a built-in defense of what they're doing. They have the attitude, if you don't like it, that's too bad, right? We're going to keep doing this. Whereas I think funk it had a way of traveling through disco in certain ways and traveling here, traveling there, but we never really consolidated, except for P-Funk. I don't think we consolidated, but even P-Funk went through changes, in the 80s, as huge and incredible that thing called P-Funk was. And you can't even call it a band. It's bigger than a band. It's just below a label. It's in some ways it's bigger than a label because there are multiple labels being used, here. But even P-Funk ends up going through that hit that everybody else takes in the 80s.
Yeah, for sure. And I think that, my own opinion, that the power of like a P-Funk at its zenith scared, some of the establishment in the record industry, and that they, felt like they weren't controlling it enough and they wanted to, so whereas with hip hop, totally agree with what you said about them being more unified. But also hip hop was easier, it was so much less expensive to produce.
Mm-hmm.
They could do it so cheaply compared to, a huge funk band. So there's the economics of it too, I think.
Yeah, that's definitely part of it. Also, I think that the funk generation was slow also to appreciate hip hop. I remember the appearance of Curtis Blow on Soul Train, and Don Cornelius says, yeah, he does this thing called rap. I don't really understand it, but, and so I think also some of the executives that were wedded to the funk era also started to lose influence around this time as well. The era of the black music divisions, et cetera. They were slow to understand that this was an important artistic expression. They kind of trivialized it, which was a loss of leverage that they could have used to still advocate for punk as well. Once they're pushed out, hey. So, that was really traumatic for me though. The loss of bands.
Oh yeah, man.
That was, I think there's a community of us, we haven't really talked about it because we don't talk about the demise of the funk band as a real, catastrophe, but it really happened in a moment. I think 1980, and now you got electro funk, and so, like Midnight Star was a big horn band that figured out. They're one of the few big bands that didn't have to shave off personnel, but still found a way to keep this big ensemble together and make music that was still relevant within those confines. But for the most part, that's not really what's happening.
No.
So that was a big change up for me.
But I'm grateful that, so many of the rappers, helped keep funk alive that way.
Yeah, I've kind of had to write about that because the very thing that a lot of musicians complained about, sampling and other things in the beginning, is also the technology that reintroduces it and what the whole art form of sampling. And I had to grow and appreciate hip hop and hip hop production as a very serious art form where there's a lot of innovation going on that has to be respected as well. That took me time because I had to grow out of this idea of saying, look, you guys didn't even play that stuff. And I had to understand what the play means from the standpoint of a hip hop producer. Playing is how do you use it? What do you slice? How all these different aspects of the hip hop production approach is. So I ended up, being a fan of a lot of the groups that survived. I think Mtume is another example. The Daz Band also was a horn band that, ended up, finding a way to be relevant in the 80s. So there are a number of groups that did so. So that also was
the time was, a great model of a band, sort of, when they worked together and they did their thing. I was wishing there'd be more like the time in the 80s,
Yeah. But then here's the secret that and music folks know, that the time was a touring group, and but the actual music making was Prince and Morris Day. That.
But did you see that 83 tour?
Yeah.
I mean, they
were
burned
killing
that stage up.
I saw them when it was Vanity Six, the Time, and Prince.
Right.
It was the Controversy tour, I believe, that I saw. every time. They didn't always come to Rochester, so sometimes they would just come to Buffalo, and we would go to Buffalo and see them. But they were incredible. So it wasn't as if they didn't have abilities.
Yeah.
It was, and in some cases, because there was a lot of resistance, in our own, masculinity and idea about manhood, and the narrow ideas we had. It was a lot easier for a lot of young men to embrace Morris Day, than Prince. We'd see Prince, dry humping on the bedpost. If you're a straight guy, you're not going to be rushing up to the front. But Morris gave you somebody to root for. You wanted to be like him. You wanted to be cool. Even though apparently, there's a lot. I did a lengthy interview with Morris Day, and I've released segments of it. But, the way that Prince and others are able to construct characters, there's a lot that reminded me of P-Funk in terms of the way that the consistency, because if you think of the same person and you create a character that's different, then you got all these alter egos and that kind of a thing,
There's so much freedom. Yeah.
A lot of freedom there. And so you're right. If more groups sounded like the time, there were groups that Ready for the World, was another group that they were in, like they had a song I liked called Digital Display.
Yeah.
And so there were lots of funky groups in the 80s, but it just didn't feel the same, and the times were changing.
Oh, for sure. And that whole MTV mess, like you mentioned, you mentioned about Morris Day. So, to me, when he first came out and he had that character, I thought to myself, man, this is the coolest character I've seen since Bootsy.
Yeah.
And there's the P-Funk thing you mentioned. So, yeah, and you've interviewed both of them, so what'd you pick up from your experience with Bootsy?
Well, what I get from Bootsy is just how much Bootsy is a character, because I was able to, I think I played a role in getting him to realize how much of a great storyteller he is for large audiences. I think the event that we did at UCLA was we had a big turnout. And actually before that, there was a conference. This is a good one. So there's a conference, there's an organization of historians, African-American historians, and the group's called ASALH, Association for the Study of African-American Life and History. And the executive director was really keen when I said, hey, let's get Bootsy. She said, well, sky's the limit, because it was in Cincinnati that year. And I remember there were a number of historians that I talked to about this, and they were not fond of the idea. They were like, I think you can do just as good of a panel without Bootsy being there. It didn't sound like something.
They looked down their noses at it.
Oh yeah, man. They weren't, a lot of them, not all of them, but a lot of them did. So it was myself on the panel, Portia Maltsby, serious music historian, and Bootsy, and then another music historian, Michelle Scott, was sort of like the moderator. And, I got up there and I'm really going 100% about the funk. So the crowd was into it. And I think it surprised Bootsy somewhat to see the responses we had, because we were a plenary session, so we had the full house. And Bootsy starts telling stories about playing with James Brown, the things that we already knew that would make him a great speaker. But I think he saw that power, and then I replicated it by bringing him to UCLA. And that was also a huge event. And I think since then, he's continued to explore that more. But what I was able to learn from him was, one, the discipline of sticking to something that you believe in, and also the humility that comes with, being a serious musician. He had no ego, like Morris, actually. Morris, very different from his personality, was a very laid back, really cool person. I mean, it wasn't, cool in a different way from the character, not somebody making snide remarks or anything like that, just a laid back and genuine person like Bootsy as well. So I think that it just showed me that there's show business and there's the business of life. And the business of life is shared by all of us in one way or the other. And so that was the real interesting part, because I was prepared for, in both cases, Morris and Bootsy, the character. I'm thinking he's gonna say, "Yeah, baby," none of that. Just, "Hey, brother, okay, can you get some soda water, you got any seltzer water or something, bro?" That kind of a thing. Very, very genuine, sincere person. His wife, Patty, just accessible, super cool people that you would want to be friends with them as is. And when we did the event in Cincinnati, he had an actual restaurant under his name, Bootsy's, and they had some of his instruments in there, kind of like a, I'm forgetting that chain where there's food and there's memorabilia, rock and roll memorabilia. I'm blanking on it, but it was sort of modeled after that, with memorabilia, music,
Hard Rock.
Yeah, something like that.
Hard Rock Cafe.
Yeah, Hard Rock. Yep,
Yeah.
Something like Hard Rock. Exactly. Yeah. And so they had that in downtown Cincinnati. So again, these are larger than life institutions and people, and they're just so down to earth. That was what I learned, that you don't.
What year was that, Scott, in Cincinnati?
Bootsy.
No, what year?
Oh, wow. That, man, that's around, I want to say 2012 or 13, but I'll get you the exact date. I have to look back at it.
So as long as 10 years before the UCLA.
I was there teaching it. It was a few years before we brought him to UCLA. We brought him to UCLA, I believe, in 2000, maybe 19 or 2018, around there. So it was some time in between. But I think, he was aware that there was something special that he had to tell as a storyteller and as a iconic figure, because that there was not an empty seat in the house in that Fowler Museum auditorium. There was not an empty seat in the house. And that's the beginning of me starting to push for bringing musicians to these academic circles. So after that, I brought Mtume to the same organization. And I didn't get the resistance to it at all. That's by then, because, the Bootsy thing had kind of established, the power of this. But the response from these intellectuals was tremendous. Even with the Bootsy case, I'm not going to say any names, but some people who were circumspect or hesitant or ambivalent about bringing Bootsy were some of the first ones lining up to take a picture with him after we, shut the place down, right? So come on, you can't go wrong with a lot of these artists. Now, what you don't want to do, I discovered, is, and I never tried this, what you don't want to do is put an artist in front of a podium and say, "Hey, give a speech on this." But what I found was very effective was to be in dialogue with them, asking them the kinds of questions that they enjoy answering. And I came up with a very radical theory, Scott, that's still not practiced. Ask musicians about music. Mm. What a radical idea. You don't have to ask them about what drugs they were taking or who's sleeping with who. But if you ask them, "And what made you want to go here on that bridge? What were you thinking when you go to da 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 dee da 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 on Skin Tight?" That's like, That's out of nowhere. Well, you talk to somebody like Billy Beck, you want to ask questions like that and you get enthusiasm from them as opposed to the same old stale thing. So I've told this story often. When I interviewed Sugarfoot, for instance, he didn't really want to talk to anybody. He was transitioning to forming his own Ohio Players at the time. And he just wasn't into doing interviews. And I spoke with two blues musicians, Sammy and Earl Reed, known as the Reed brothers, who were really his elders and, his teachers in some ways, And I was talking with them and they were able to pick up the phone. Next thing you know, I'm in Sugarfoot's living room. But he said to me, as soon as I got there, he said, I got a question for you before we get started. I said, yes, sir, Mr. Foots. Said, do you play anything yourself? Mm-hmm. I said, funny you should ask that, sir. I'm a bass player. And I actually brought my bass with me because I was in Dayton for about a month, 3 weeks doing interviews, and it's around 2007. And he said, go get it. And his first question was, because he was on the piano, he taught himself how to play piano. And he said, can you play Skin Tight? So I go into Skin Tight, I go into the main groove. And he's like, can you play the bridge? So I get that scale down because actually Marshall Jones taught me that scale that he did there. And, he told me, keep practicing, you might could make you some money. Now we can do the interview. So I had to get pledged. And so being that I knew the songs, most of my heroes, and this is what gets me to Dayton, as a funk enthusiast in Rochester, I later realized that 3 of my, top 10 funk bass players came from Dayton. Marshall Jones, Mark Adams from Slade, and Marvin Craig from Lakeside. So that was already in my head, like, man, once I realized where they were from, it was more like, well, how is it? What's going on there? And that sort of piqued my interest in that city. So asking musicians about music, that actually is something that's still I'm always shocked by these interviews with folks who are not music-minded people that are more interested in, celebrity gossip type themes when you've got these total geniuses sitting in front of you, right?
That's why I started my show to begin with in 2017, because I hadn't heard those questions asked or seen them have, especially funk artists, get the chance to share that. And for me, it's all about the music. I mean, I want to know everything. I can't know too much about the music.
Yeah. And that comes out. And so it's a narrower audience but that's okay. It's okay that your work is going to speak to people that care more about that. I had to discover that. But once I got the formula down and realized how musicians, and that was Mtume's point to me, he said the highest form of intellect is art and the highest form of art is intellect. Don't separate the two. And just drill down on what overlap you find in that journey. And that really did a lot for my own understanding of how much artists have to share that is valuable to our understanding of not just the music, but history and all kinds of other things.
When did you first go to Dayton?
Dayton?
Yeah, when did you first go there?
Around 2004. One of the first persons I interviewed was Steve Arrington. There's a music historian and organizer who he had a funk museum set up at the library just near Central State University. His name is Michael Sampson. And I connected with Michael Sampson, who was working with Portia Maltsby, the music historian in Indiana. And out of that, there were some introductions made. So everything is a snowball from going there, meeting one. So it's taken me 20 years to do this book because I was really I became a part of that community, and I have lifelong friends from doing that work. And to the extent that when I started recording, I got so much help from people like Keith Harrison from Phaso. I was recording in such an amateurish way before I met him because I was putting everything up the middle, on the tracks. And he said, Scott, man, you got to pan, man. You got to give everything in space. That was a revelation to me, as I'm using, these recording softwares. And so that's really part of the experience. And I wouldn't rush it. Like, people have frequently asked, why is it taking so long? When is it coming out? But I've interviewed at least 150 people, getting all these interviews transcribed and so these stories that I have are much more grounded in them being comfortable with me and knowing that I play. And so, and most of the stories that I tell are related to music performance, the kind of environment of music education, arts, community-based arts education, where old cats are showing you stuff and not charge you, but just insisting that you play it and practice, right? I came up out of that. So I built relationships and let it flow, and I wouldn't have gone any quicker because I don't think I would arrive at some of the conclusions that I have come to, in really engaging this community in that way.
Well, in a nutshell, though, and I ask this of so many I've interviewed from Dayton, what are a couple of qualities that you think made that situation come to fruition? That it coalesced like that in that particular area to just bring forward so much amazing art in the form of funk.
I always waver on this because there are some things that are distinctive about Dayton, and there are also some things that are no different than any other industrial town as far as the amount of talent that's there. The big thing is, as is the case with Minneapolis, you have an artist at their height that is still based in that community. So what is it about Dayton that makes the Ohio players who were, they were arena level band in the early 1970s, but they still stayed in Dayton, Ohio? What does that do to a community when you have such a big group that's located, but you can see members at the grocery store? You could drive by and see an artist Lamborghini driving down the street with their name on the side of the car, right? So that is a very transformative, in that local talent that you can find in so many places now has an outlet. I think when we think about music cities, Scott, the tendency is to think about the entrepreneurial map. So Motown's in Dayton, Stax is in Memphis, right? Philly International in Philly, Solar Records in Los Angeles, right? So we tend to think of music cities in many respects, not by way of the quantity of artists. And there are lots of cities, I think, that have stories like Dayton, but Dayton was special in that there's got to be something very infectious about even trying to seek success when you have it right in your midst. And in many cases, I've got stories of, members of Ohio players teaching people how to play, even when they're already, a top group, spending time, taking time, doing things. So I think they're able to take this landscape because, when you grow up in a city that's a medium-sized city, it's an industrial town, it's very hard to see success at its height in your midst. Usually you dream about leaving. One day I'm going to get to New York City, man, and one day I'm going to get to LA. But what happens when you have groups? And then you have Zap and Roger, who really built a whole movement, which included housing construction and things of that nature, along with recording in Dayton. So there's a way that the parochial nature of the city, meaning that the fact that it's so internal that people want to stay put. We usually look at that and say, you all are some narrow-minded folks. You don't leave. You guys don't go anywhere. But there's something about being that way that pushes you into developing your own thing, because you're not venturing out. You're not seeking success elsewhere. There's something about day. I was talking to someone. I don't know if quantitatively this is right, but I always notice the number of streets in Dayton that are named after local politicians, local prominent figures, right? And so there's something very internal about it, and it has its problems. You know, when people get into their knowing other folks, having arguments and disputes that remain intact. But there's also something really generative and creative about staying put in a place that's not on the map and constantly working to create your own kind of entertainment, if you will, and your own version of celebrity. And like Rochester, there's some musicians in Rochester, I'm telling you, you would think that they are living on Sunset Boulevard because they know they are the baddest musicians around, right? And when they play, they remind us that, but they're not necessarily measuring success by being elsewhere. So I think that's part of what's in the water. You say something's in the water. Part of what's in the water is a real confidence and comfort with oneself as they are. Then they have the Ohio players. And then they also probably have, I mean, you think about the level, the multi-genius, Junie Morrison, for instance, right? Before Prince, this guy's playing every instrument and even can play wind instruments. Roger Troutman. And the amount of musicians in Dayton that play multiple instruments, take someone like someone in a band like Slave that can play keys, someone like Floyd Miller who's jumping from instrument to instrument, right? So there's also a per capita amount of talent there. The question that I'm interested in is, how does that amount of talent reach the airwaves? And I think the big factor is top tier groups staying put, being accessible, and being able to mentor. Because you and I know, we know lots of talented people that will never be heard, right, outside of the networks that they're in. So that's, I think, what makes the difference. But there is also an incredible amount of talent that became infectious in that city.
Believe it or not, I've not been there. It's like on my bucket list to get to Dayton and just to, it's like a pilgrimage, really.
Yes,
be done.
Yeah, it is a pilgrimage. I mean, you've got the monument to Roger Troutman, right where the studios were. That was like a very, very powerful place to visit. And believe it or not, many of the musicians are still there. And, the interesting part is, like, you do the interview with the artists and you're talking about the past. And when the interview ends, you say, oh, by the way, here's my new CD. And you're saying, wow, wait a minute, you're still making music today? And many of them are. From their perspective, and this is where I think it's important as a music historian and scholar of the funk, is not to talk about it as over with, or to talk about it as, because it finds its way back one way or the other. The funk is always going to be there, and it will come out in different forms. So I had to grow past this. Historians like rise and fall. Like an episode of like the TV show that I was on a lot called Unsung. Great show that told wonderful stories, but usually these stories are often told not just on Unsung, but even in other music documentaries and other networks and programs. Everything was going good. They were at the top of their game. And then came one thing or another that pushed them, like what is it? Rags to riches.
Yeah, it's kind of formulaic. Yeah.
It's very formulaic, and that's not the way the funk works.
The continuum.
It's a continuum, and it finds its way through. So that's where I'm glad sticking around and working on this meticulously over the course of 2 decades is how I got to that conclusion. I could have easily gotten something out earlier without having the insights that I've acquired over time.
So then when do you think it might come to be?
I'm glad you asked that, because I'm finally close to the finish line. I've submitted it for review. Different people have reviewed it. I'm probably adding a bit more on the conclusion side and a little bit more background on the city itself. But the main chapters, in terms of the meat of the music, actually are done. And I see it coming out sometime in hopefully 2025. But I don't see myself.
Crossed.
Fingers
crossed.
Well, there's so many things that outside of our control when it comes out. I'm working with a university press, and they have to go through their whole thing with reviews and etc. But no, this is where I can be confident, because I thought I was close before, and I really am now. So I gotta see. I think by late December, I'll have what I want to write in there, and hopefully then the process will move it forward. So I hopefully by the end of 2025.
We, of course, lost too many of those folks during the 2 decades, We've
lost so many of them, and I was really fortunate to actually meet so many and interview so many people before they transitioned. There's a spiritual element to funk music, and there's a spiritual element to doing a work like this, because even with the folks not here, there's just something about what drives you to keep going. This story is contributing to their legacy as well, how they are remembered. So with that in mind, I don't, people say, well, hey, they never lived to see it come out. But what comes out is a contribution to their legacy that other generations, once we get this stuff in print, will be able to have access to.
Do you talk about anyone, other areas of Ohio as well, or just purely Dayton? Because obviously, you mentioned Cincinnati, but I mean, Ohio outside of Dayton is pretty damn funky too.
It is very funky. So it's like an epicenter within an epicenter, right? And even, it's arguable because, some people come from cities and towns that are in between Dayton and Cincinnati, like Roger Troutman and the Troutman family. They're from Hamilton. And, Roger was doing things in Cincinnati and doing things in Dayton. And, and also they had the record label, about James Brown and all of those things that make Cincinnati special. So I don't, yeah, I'm not arguing that Dayton is necessarily more important than those other places. It just seems to be a place where there was a steady pipeline, probably per capita the highest number of self-contained bands to acquire major record deals, right? But that isn't, even smaller to Akron. Look at Akron with Howard Hewitt, James Ingram. You have Canton, Ohio. That's where the OJs come out of. You have so many places where there's music everywhere. So you're right. The state of Ohio and some of the conditions in Ohio are great conditions for bands. And since bands are not the exclusive but principal unit of artistic creativity for funk, there are funk solo artists as well, but the dominant unit is a band of some sort, right? And that grows out of certain kinds of conditions, that I think made it such that Ohio is just a funky state. All the way up to Cleveland, a jazz band. You just go down every pocket, there's something.
I think also just what I'm just thinking about as you're talking, Scott, Dayton developing like it did, with those self-contained bands. I mean, also because they were isolated like they were away from the larger music industry, they had to sort of self-produce
Yeah.
and learn so many you know talents on different instruments and things because
Mm.
they were isolated that way. So I didn't really think about it that much before, but because I always loved, especially the self-produced, the self-contained bands, because they had their artistic vision that was uncompromised, you know, for the most part. Until
Un-
sometimes they got with a big label, and the big label maybe would try to get them to do a disco song or something. But
that's right. That's right. And see, that's another point because some people say, well, are these really funk bands? And I say, yes, they are. But labels were not committed to funk. They were committed to charting. And you find disco records, ballads, other things, in addition to the funk. On even a group like Confunction, they got funk in their name. They don't produce pure funk albums because labels want a certain variety of sounds. So there are very few outside of P-Funk. There are very few groups that actually can do a majority funk album. But you can hear on the songs that they do funk on, that that's their thing, right? You can hear it. So, and the group like Slave, they're kind of a classic example of a label shaping and pushing them to do things, and recordings outside of what they may have even wanted to do. So that's a part that I had to kind of decipher, and getting those backstories about why a song was included on an album is very important. Getting those backstories about whole album projects that never came out because
oh
the
yeah,
label was not
this is
satisfied,
tragic a lot of times. Yeah.
right? Label wasn't satisfied with the commercial viability of it all, right? So I had to come to understand that because a lot of people have said to me when I brought up different groups, well, are they really funk? I'm like, yeah, they really are. And if you didn't get to see them live, you might not know it because that's when they can do the vamps and the different things in between the songs to let you know what their preferences are.
I've found it reassuring in talking to so many the funk artists from back in the day that so many of the thoughts I had about some of those tracks, like that they were kind of like compromising or wasn't at their best, and I would feel like kind of nervous about bringing that forward because maybe they thought it was great. But in most cases, they kind of realized that they were sort of, doing it for the label, or they weren't, that keen on a particular track, and they kind of knew that they had some turmoil going on in the band and it wasn't at their best. You know, they're pretty self-aware of their work, is what I found.
Very self-aware of it, and also sometimes it's almost like a threat. This person has to do this or else because a lot of these labels had these contracts where the label would have the right of refusal after so many records, right? The labels, the contracts, would often tilt the creative direction in a way that the band could not insist. And that's what, so much of the genius of P-Funk is not just the brilliance of the musicians, it's also the visionary way as an entity, even though many musicians weren't treated as good as they could have been, as I'm learning more, but the way that creatively they had a certain kind of creative freedom that most bands didn't have, as far as just being able to do what they want to do, and still find a way to have a hit record on there that's big enough for them to now do what they want to do, right? So it's a difficult thing, and this is where I get back to my point earlier. We didn't consolidate institutions to define and protect this thing called funk. And I keep comparing it to country western because, that's something that people organized around and said, we're going to protect this thing. The CMA, for instance, Well, we haven't really done that. I would one of the dreams of great funk drummer who I got to know, Frankie Cash Waddy, is he wants a Funk Awards, that not just deals with the past greats, but also rewards and inspires new funk artists. And they exist. There are funk. If you go on Spotify or these other things, you write, new funk in the search or something like that, you'll see a whole list of bands that we would never hear elsewhere. So that means that we can still encourage and inspire a lot of what made funk special for us in our era.
And you mentioned the France thing. There's a lot of funk all over the world, and
That's
a lot of people that are still making funk all over the world.
Yeah.
Anything that can encourage it, support it. I was curious how you feel about the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame, ironically being in the state of Ohio, especially, and not giving funk and funk bands their due. I mean, Kool and the Gang finally got in. Man,
Yeah.
how long overdue was that? And
Right.
there's so many, and your own state, the Ohio Players. I mean, how can they be overlooked?
They should have been in the Hall of Fame, the Ohio Players, a long time ago. But at the same time, there's another issue, and that is we've somehow let rock and roll become this broad kind of way that basically says any great artist is a rock and roll artist. And so I really think what we're really dealing with a kind of music Hall of Fame as opposed to a rock and roll Hall of Fame. But it's become this anything now any great artist in their respective genres expect and desire to be in the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame. That's not a problem, but I think we're still at this interesting moment where some people see it as a style of music. When you go in the Hall of Fame, you look at the exhibits, etc., right? And you see that there's something specific about rock and roll, but at the same time, it has now expanded to just about any musical genre. But if we're looking at it as acknowledgement of greatness, musical greatness in popular music, the Ohio Players should have been there, of course. I would argue Heatwave should have been in there, even though they had a limited run because of tragedy. That was an incredible band that, you don't get Off the Wall and Thriller without.
Yeah, Rod Temperton, yeah.
Temperton, Johnny Wilder, it's just so much there. So I do have a problem with it, but my issue is if it's going to be popular music Hall of Fame, then we have to be consistent and embrace funk artists and not try to do what MTV did, which is say, we're not going to play videos from R&B and funk groups because we're actually rock formatted. Then you look at the format and you see all these other artists that are not R&B, that are not rock, that are being promoted, but they're excluding certain people. So I think we got to balance that out. You're right. Come on, Ohio Players. There are few groups out here that have as many hits that are anthemic anthems that another generation even knows. I saw an interview today, actually, with Vice President Harris talking about the song "Fire," and then she even hummed.
She's hip to the funk, yeah.
Yeah, she even hummed the bass line. She said, "Fire, boom, boom, boom." I said, "Wow." That's how powerful it is, but it's still yet to be acknowledged. So we may need a twofold strategy. We may need to put pressure on the mainstream to acknowledge it, but we also need to do some funk-specific things, like what you're doing with funk and stuff, right? We need some funk specificity. Because even with my own music, people expect my music to be funk music. I said, I have too much respect for the funk to say my songs are funk songs. Most of them R&B and mid-tempo.
Yeah, it might be funky here and there.
Maybe funky, but there's a difference, right? There's a difference between being jazzy and being jazz. And I think we need to put some fences, not necessarily fences to keep people out, but markers of the space that funk has.
Yeah. Yeah, to me, I mean, once you let in people like P-Funk and Prince and Earth, Wind, and Fire, you
Right.
got to open the door for the others that are deserving.
Exactly. No, that's a very good point because they've already made that step. You can't be selective about it. And so I think you're right. Then, and I don't know, you might know more about this, but I'm fairly certain that most of these award shows have some kind of politics behind the scenes that the average person or average consumer doesn't know much about, right? I don't know what kinds of things trigger, an award show like that one or an awards Hall of Fame status. That's one thing that's so interesting about the American Music Awards is that it's straight record sales, right? They don't, it's not, they don't have a whole lot of, well, what is this? What is that? And so that makes it clearer. But there are a lot of value judgments involved in these decisions. And those are the kind of things we have to get at.
Maybe we should marshal our powers together and try to finally get a funk Grammy category.
Yes, that is something I think that is valuable and something that I could advocate for. And I'm in the kinds of circles where I could. It's crossed my mind before, but I think we really need to do that as a matter of self-preservation.
I mean, it's so long overdue. It's absurd, but I mean, the subcategories they have now, it's so granular to not have funk or something with funk in it, at least that maybe has others too, that at least has a chance for funk to get recognized formally in a program like that.
I think it's a great idea, Scott. I think we can I think we'll get a whole lot of signatures on a petition.
Yeah, I mean, you get George on the Walk of Fame now and things like that. He's been around long enough to finally come full circle and start to really, at least for him and P-Funk and funk overall, I think, to get a higher profile that way.
I agree. I think that's a great step. So the good news about ideas like that is you don't have to hoard them, meaning that, okay, I don't care who gets it going and who is like, hey, I came up with this first, or, I talked about this with Scott Gold. Hey, more power to you. Let's get it done.
For sure. Yeah, it's all about, for me, the artists and the songs and the music. They've given me so much of my life. I could not possibly give back enough. So,
yeah.
You
And so, yeah, no, I think that's right. That's how I feel about it as well. I do plan on having some kind of musical accompaniment to the book as well, which would be obviously much more couched in the funk sounds. But I think that R&B, funk, soul, all of these different categories have overlap, but there is still something distinct about funk. That there's something special there.
For sure.
And by making it harder for bands to get access to being heard through the airwaves and other places, that's one way of silencing the funk.
Well, the time we have left, appreciate all your time. It's been so much fun talking to you, Scott. I got to put you on the spot and say, if you could only have 5 funk albums all time, what would you take onto that desert island, into that, first person to live on Mars, whatever?
It's a hard one because some of the albums that I'm thinking of are not necessarily funk albums, but they're groups that could do funk. Like you take a group like Heatwave.
Yeah.
Ain't no half stepping, right? But they did all kinds of, but I really love Central Heating. I also, one of my favorite groups is also the group Slave. And even given all the changes they went through, I feel like I kind of grew up with that group. And there's so many different albums, in that catalog. Like the concept album, was very impactful. But Just a Touch of Love, because it was so big of a success story, my ears were all over every one of those songs. And I'm a bass player too, so that's another bias. P-Funk, Aqua Boogie, Motor Booty Affair. It's really, I don't know what they were at a whole nother level. And I also like the fact that both Junie Morrison and Burrell are on the same album. So you just got, on that level, it's astronomical. It's extremely conceptual, like so many others, but there's just something about that album to me that leaves me always discovering more, whether it's Rumpelstiltskin, Mr. Wiggles, Aqua Boogie, One of Those Funky Things. It's just one of those really incredible works I see as a kind of almost a culmination piece. Let's see.
Can you play Rumpelstiltskin's line on bass?
Oh yeah, I can play Rumpelstiltskin. That was required in Rochester. If I should have brought my bass and plugged it up, where it's all in the other room there. But yeah, I had to learn it. And in Rochester, when you play the bass line, if you got one note wrong, there's always somebody that says, "You playing that wrong." And it's like, okay, how am I playing it wrong? And then they show you one little thing you didn't do. And that was enough to qualify you or disqualify you from saying, the song. But Rumpelstiltskin was something that, because Chocolate City, the group that I was telling you about, was so influenced by P-Funk, they knew how to do a lot of those songs. They were really, they had their own sound, but they learned fusion stuff. So funk was like this playground for them where they could do their very sophisticated musical things, but also have fun with it. And I think P-Funk gave that because, the musicians in P-Funk were just incredible. So those are three of them. Cameosis was another big album for me.
Shake Your Pants,
Cameosis, the actual title track of the song. The ballads on Cameosis, Why Have I Lost You? And then the mid-tempo jam, We're Going Out Tonight.
Mm-hmm.
That was, there are certain songs that just make you feel what the theme is, right?
Yeah, the feeling. Yeah, that gives.
It just makes you want to get dressed up and go out, So Cameo, I'm trying to think of what other, I know. The other album I would say is Pleasure, Special Things. That had a lot of
Nate Phillips.
Yeah. Oh, of course. And also the drummer, and also the guitarist, I'm blanking on his name.
Marlon McClain?
Yes. McClain's incredible. We just love that group Pleasure. Because they could do so many styles of music. I even heard a Daz Band live album, which has Nate Phillips and McClain in the rhythm section. And you can hear those guys just having fun with it. They're doing so many different things that still stick with the Daz Band in terms of its sound. But you can clearly hear that these are some sophisticated musicians that the first three letters of funk is really what's driving them to do it. They're having fun.
Mm. Yeah. I don't know if you've caught Marlon McClain still will lay those licks on Facebook and just post them all the time. And
yeah,
he's too much.
He's incredible. And then the bass line on Glide, that was another requirement. Everybody thinks they know how to play Glide. I think I know how to play Glide, right? But I saw Nate Phillips demonstrated, and he does now like smooth jazz and all kinds of stuff, plays on a 5-string and does all these different things because he's that kind of musician that can play anything. But he said, "Oh yeah, this is what I was doing," and he shows, it's the simplicity. You think it's requiring more, but sometimes with funk, it's what you don't play as much as what you play. And what those classic lines have. You take a line like Mark Adams on Slide, the simplicity of it all. A lot of people say, "Oh, that's easy." The main line was on one string. Boom, 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 boom. But how does your mind hear a groove like that and then lay it in the pocket and to know, look, this is all I need, as opposed to kind of noodling and throwing a lick in every 4 bars. Now, he does a lot of licks as well, but they're so tastefully placed. And somehow with Mark Adams, he was able to go everywhere and still keep the pocket. That part there was just a mind blower to me, because I feel that Robert Cool Bell, look at how many lines you can hum. Hollywood Swinging, boom, 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 right? You can hum those lines. Ladies' Night, boom, 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 boom.
It's like the whole song almost.
Huh?
It's like the whole song, the bass line on Ladies' Night.
Yeah. And so from my perspective, that kind of musical play where you understand the pocket and the spacing is more important than being able to do the most complicated thing. All of them could, but they understood something about translating their genius to everyday people that I really appreciate.
When you talk about the live difference, how some people just hear the hits or whatever, they don't realize, see them live, then man, they throw down like crazy. That's the thing too, is a lot of these guys seem so contained within the tracks, but if you ever go see them live, you're like, oh man, this dude could be playing anything he wants.
Exactly. Yeah. And that's what's missing, I think, in a lot of what I'm seeing today. There's the recording and there's the live show. They constituted 2 separate art forms. There were some groups that had great records, but they couldn't hold your attention live, or groups that didn't have, gold and platinum records, but with, like, for instance, when I saw Cameo, I didn't know where my eyes should go on the stage, because
they were wild.
The horn players were doing choreography. You had a bass player doing this Verdine White moving around, and you could follow Aaron Mills anywhere, right? You have this huge drum set that's on a riser with the drummer singing, right? Then you have the keyboard player, Gregory Johnson, I believe, right?
Yep.
And he's doing his thing. I mean, it was like a 4D experience where every part of the stage was its own show within the show. And so you're absolutely right. The live experience, I think, has really suffered by way of the demise of a lot of these bands.
But that's one of the amazing things that hopefully will bring more attention to funk acts, is the fact when they get seen live, it can leave an unforgettable impression. Yeah,
it does. And I can't erase those experiences because they were part of my coming of age, especially my junior high school years and my high school years. Those experiences are tied into a whole era. I don't know how to describe that special feeling you felt when you, just before the group starts, right? Because they're usually doing sound checking and messing around. You hear them playing some loud music, the lights are on. But that moment, they're about to begin and the lights have come down. I don't know how to describe that feeling I had, but it's a high that
euphoria. Yeah,
there's a high. It's not, no drug can give you that, and that was a part of that moment.
What's your favorite track or two on Central Heating?
Mind-blowing decisions and Send Out for Sunshine. Also Central Heating. Central Heating takes a beating. But they're doing so many incredible blends of jazz, funk, a little fusion thing. Then you have Johnny Wilder, Johnny Wilder did all the background vocals on Heatwave. That was a specialty. And he has this almost like the Beach Boys backgrounds. You know how they're so layered and stacked. And he would do all of these stacked harmonies, leave your worries behind. The way you hear that, it sounds so big, and it's one person. And I am of the theory, and I haven't proven this, but this is my theory, that Johnny Wilder's associations with Rod Temperton had a lot to do with moving Michael Jackson from harmonizing with his brothers to having that big background sound on Off the Wall. That the way that Heatwave and Way Wilder was doing these harmonies informed the way, I believe, Temperton and Michael Jackson collaborated. I can't prove it. Maybe Quincy Jones or someone can chime in here.
Corroborate, yeah.
Yeah, not to say that Michael Jackson is not a talent second to none. That's not what I'm saying, but there are other players involved in how a sound ends up getting to a particular place, sometimes even going past the songwriter or producer.
I don't know if you caught my Jerry Hay interview, but he talked about Rod Temperton. They were good friends, apparently, a lot. And it was really fascinating to me to just find out more about Rod Temperton and the extent of his talent. So, what you're saying. And I'd heard that some of those songs that went to Michael Jackson, he was willing to give to Heatwave, but they sort of weren't wanting all those.
Yeah, and I can understand it because they wouldn't have been the same song anyway, right? Because if Michael Jackson does a song, it is Michael Jackson's song. Let's be clear. Michael Jackson can take something and really transform it. So it may not have sounded. So I think on YouTube at one point there were some demos of like, I think Rock With You or one of these songs, and Rod Temperton is sort of humming the melody out and that kind of a thing. Well, it's hard to imagine you're going to get the end product that you get when you hear that, right? And not to mention, I think that Heatwave did their share of kind of lyrically light dance records, but they also had a tremendous depth also in a lot of their compositions that, dealt with hardship, dealt with, some of the melancholy things as well. It could have very well sounded like another return to a Boogie Nights groove line. But like I said, Send Out for Sunshine, that's a song that's a social commentary, as well as, and they know how to make social commentary still feel good. That's what's incredible about that group.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, Johnny Wilder, I think, is one of those, you mentioned the term unsung, not equating it to the TV show, but truly unsung.
Oh my gosh. And then you look at what Wilder did with being able to record after his accident, debilitating accident. And if you listen to some of those gospel records he did on his own, because they're all a lot of this a cappella stuff, it is just incredible. It's magic to the ears. So I do believe that he is someone that needs further exploration because he was so far ahead of his time, especially like in terms of the way we talk about disability and how people overcome and still manage to make strong contributions in spite of that marginalization that comes from the society. He overcame all of that. And you listen to people from Heatwave, he was still leading Heatwave, while he was needing assistance to move around and things like that. So there's a really heroic story in there as well to be told.
Did you get to meet Keith Wilder?
Oh, yes. Keith Wilder is one of my men. I was heartbroken by losing him. He's responsible for my getting on Unsung, actually. So I was going to London when I met him. I had a date to be in London, and he said he was going to be in London too. And I interviewed him, and then I told him, well, I'm going to be in London, and I'm going to interview Byron Bird from Sun over there in the UK. And he said, well, I'm going to be there then. And, Byron's my brother-in-law. So, we're all going to hang out then if you're going to be there then. And I said, wow, okay. Well, we didn't get over to Byron Bird's together, but I went to see Keith at a hotel, and they were interviewing him for Unsung. And I had already interviewed with him, and he jokingly said, you need to talk to this man here. He knows more about Heatwave than me. It was just a joke. Of course, I don't. But so because the producer at the time, they were shooting out of LA, knew I was going back to LA, it was sort of a convenient thing. That was the first time I'd done anything on TV, was the Heatwave Unsung. I was so giddy. I was singing and stuff on, I was losing. I was just having a good, I was like, this is my moment, and I'm about to give it all up. And so that was part of what opened the door for me to do it. Then I did about 10, I think about 8, 9, 10 episodes after that. So Keith Wilder was phenomenal. And he's also, Keith Wilder was as generous of a person as Grady was as a singer and showman. He was extremely, you met him, if he vibed with you, you were he never met a stranger. Extremely generous, extremely talented, and extremely critical too, because anytime I said anything that was a little off with the interview, he'd say, no, that's not how it happened. And he'd correct you, but that was just in the spirit of getting the story right. And at the same time, he was just a really beautiful human being. The whole family is the Wilder family, and are just beautiful people. And his daughters actually even have a vocal group that's really good. They just did a remake of Always and Forever that's really powerful. So again, that's an example of the kind of friendships, connections that come from being so persistent in the research, and also the staying power and being around and showing up. So that was that whole experience just opened lots of doors up for my understanding of music in a much broader way.
That's cool. I would not be mad at you if you said Keith Wilder is the best out of all the great singers that came out of Dayton, that he is probably at the top.
Well, Keith is interesting because he will always defer to Johnny, his older brother.
No, well, that's what I meant, Johnny. Did I say Keith?
Johnny Wilder. Okay.
Johnny Wilder. Yeah.
Yeah. I never got to meet Johnny Wilder. I did get to meet, Johnny and Keith. So Keith is more of the
guitar player and
sound, rough, like on Groove Line, taking you on a trip, ain't no seats, and then the falsettos and all those beautiful harmonies, and that's Johnny. But yeah. I would agree with you, but I think that I put Johnny Wilder up there with the best among the best of vocalists, because you don't know too many vocalists that turn backgrounds into a lead voice. He stacks these harmonies, and he comes out of a Glee Club, tradition, and it's just brilliant, total brilliance, and it has everything to do with why those songs are so memorable, to us, that you can just hear all that in the music. And what happens, Scott, is every 2 or 3 years, I discover a new group. So because there's so many groups, I had to discover them from doing the research. There's a great group, of course, you probably heard of, Platypus. They never became top billing because they were signed to Casablanca right around the time when Casablanca was going through changes and then the death of Neil Bogart. But man, the music is incredible. You take a group like Phaso. Phaso is an incredible group, but they just were on a label that was not really able to push them the way they should.
At least they got their one big hit.
Riding High. Yeah, they got Riding High out there. But I would say they're one of the closest to a funk band, meaning that their cut tracks on their albums are unapologetically funk, because I don't think they had a label that was interfering with their artistic direction in the way that some of the other groups did. So, but they were phenomenal. I'm trying to think of another, of course, Junie Morrison, getting deep into Junie Morrison and listening to some of that stuff is really funk music for sophisticated funk listeners. It's
eclectic. Yeah.
It's eclectic, and only somebody who really digs this at a high level is going to be able to appreciate it. But his genius had no limits. So every few years I go through this thing where I dive deep into one group and they become my favorite, or what I'm writing about at the time. So, I finished writing a lot about Slave. So I have a lot of that in my head. I had written about Heatwave. I've written about these groups. I've written about Phaso. I tried to write about all the groups that got major record deals as much as I could. Sun is another group, that had constantly changing personnel, but there's something there that you hear, that you feel, whether it's Radiation Level, whether it's Sun Is Here, whether it's Mind-Blowing Decisions. You got Kim Yancey, who, ends up penning two of their biggest hits. All these backstories that give us this very rich, textured experience when we dig these sounds. So I go through that. So I think of late, it's really Heatwave has been big on my mind, and Slave has as well of late because of my work.
Slave is definitely a tough one to pick for the favorite album. You went with the concept, and you mentioned just a touch of love. But I mean, you could easily just also go with Showtime or Stone Jam or
Stone Jam. I mean, look, that actually, let me be okay. Stone Jam is actually my favorite by Slave, because I played it we played Stone Jam. Chang, 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 chang. And it was really funny because I would ask artists these questions like, what were you thinking? Like, think of Stone Jam. What bass player thinks of a line like that? And so those are kind of questions I would entertain when I interviewed Adams before he passed on, obviously. And it was a great experience because I knew enough about the band and some of the stories I'd heard about the band to get him to actually, because part of this process of interviewing folks is letting them know that you have done your homework and you know enough about them for them to say to you, wow, I never thought of it. I never thought of that question. Let me think. And I noticed that, even with the interviews you do, that sometimes it's like, they're kind of ready for the standard answers, and then you give them some questions that push them, right? So, no, Stone Jam actually is the one that I think is my favorite. Because
I would probably pick that too.
Yeah, I would pick that because what they were doing with production, with Jimmy Douglas, that's when Starlina is there. It's almost like we thought Slave would be this huge group in the coming decade, but we didn't know the backstories. Yeah, I think that Stone Jam was special. And that was like the crystallization of this thing. And we expected Slave to be dominant in the 80s. And there was a backstory, of things really starting to unravel. And what I was really shocked, I remember telling one person I interviewed that when we went to see them on tour, they were on tour with the Gap Band. When I went to see them on tour, they were on tour with the Gap Band. I was expecting to see Starlina, all these other people. And they had already had that split, with Some folks go into aura, etc. But I thought that album was amazing. It was a combination of high production, musical freedom. Like I can play, that's one of the few albums I can play from start to finish all the way. And I dig every song on that album.
Yeah, Baby Sinister's on there, right?
No, Baby Sinister is on, I want to say
That's not on the Hardness of the World, is it?
Hardness of the World, yeah.
Oh, it is.
Yeah, it's on Hardness of the World, the second
The Sizzling Hot? Is that
Sizzling Hot is on
Okay.
Stone Jam.
Yeah.
And, I've heard stories about, that was pushed as a single at first. And Watching You came about not with the intention of the label, but by some other maneuvers that happened to get that out. And that, of course, that single took the album to the next level, but it's a phenomenal album. Feel My Love, Starting Over, man. Yeah. And our band that I was in, we played a lot of Slave, and we had a really phenomenal female vocalist, Angela Bridges. So, we really tapped into, Slave a lot, when we were playing in the 80s.
Yeah, I was disappointed Slave did not tour much, so they never came to, Los Angeles where I was.
Oh, wow.
Because I saw almost everybody at some point, but Slave. And also, you mentioned earlier, I saw Prince like 50 times probably, but every time he came to LA, I saw him. But that tour with Rick James, they never came to LA.
Well, they may have split up, right? By the time Rick James because
yeah,
I think they had some friction and, that kind of a thing. Slave came when I was in, I believe, seventh grade, maybe eighth grade. And it was around the time of the concept album. They played at Brockport College, and I was on punishment, and I couldn't go. And looking back at it, there's very little, if any, footage of Slave in that period of time, right? And that's actually something that is worth trying to find at some of the places they played. Now, you see their images of playing live on some of the albums. You'll see the pictures of them, on, I believe, A Hardness of the World or the concept, but we don't have any footage of them playing live. And the footage we have is later on, and in some cases, most cases, I think they're lip syncing, so, because some shows, they weren't able to play live on, but we don't get that. And I think that's one of the missing links here.
Yeah, some vintage live Slave footage.
Oh, wow.
Come on, Questlove, dig that up.
Yeah, because I have I've read reviews of their shows and people are very excited about them, but I don't, because they're their whole blend of rock with funk, and then they had horns going alongside, distortion.
Probably the closest thing to like Parliament Funkadelic in that way.
Yeah, yeah. And they were really, with Stellar Funk and some of the things, that got on to the Steve Washington side of the album that's produced on Just a Touch of Love. They were really cultivating their own funk approach, because I think that the model, George Clinton, and having different entities and really pushing the limits was very much emulated by different groups, and Slave was headed in that direction.
Have you ever been able to meet Steve Washington?
I've talked to him on the phone, never gotten to meet him. Another one of the great geniuses, multi-talented, and his genius is as much being an engineer in the studio and producer, in as much as he can. I mean, he's a trumpet player, bass player, guitar player. Oh my gosh. So that's the part of the story that I have to make sure that people realize, that you've got, people that can play your instrument better than you, and that's not their first instrument. Incredible.
Self-taught in a lot of cases.
Yes. And, so a lot of that sound that made Slave famous, of course, you've got one of the greatest engineers, Jimmy Douglas, but you also have one of the, so much talent and a production ear of Steve Washington. And sometimes they were at odds, but the end product is a phenomenal one on the recording side. So he's someone else. So yes, you got to add Steve Washington to that list that I was given of the multi-geniuses. Even though he's from New Jersey, through, the Ohio players, he becomes a major figure in the Dayton sound.
Absolutely. Are there a couple other people that have just been like the top thrills for you to meet that you've had the opportunity that, I don't know if you've met people like Stevie Wonder, for example, or whoever, but.
I think Steve Arrington was another person because I was interviewing Cedell Carter, who's also a very important person in Slave's story, also a multi-instrumentalist. And I was interviewing him. He said, I know you don't just want to talk to me. You want to talk to Steve Arrington, don't you? That sounded so far-fetched because I didn't know that they were all still in touch like that. And I said, yeah, but I tried to shift the conversation to saying, well, you are important. Like, you know what I mean? Like, so don't say that and then diminish the importance of the person you're interviewing. So he didn't let me know what he was up to. And so about 15 minutes later, Steve Arrington knocks on his door, and I didn't interview him right then and there. We just talked, and just the vibe, the imagination, and the shared excitement, paved the way for the interview. And that was just the element of surprise. It's one of my heroes, one of the great vocal stylists. What he does with vocals changed vocals, just like Sugarfoot. There's so many people that are doing aspects of what Arrington was doing. That was probably a moment. And I actually had to think beforehand when we did an interview, like, got to make sure I cover this and cover that. So that was really, really an exciting moment for me as well.
He's great to talk to because he's like a historian of the music himself.
He really is. He really is a historian of the music. And I mean, he was giving me a lot of information, like, oh, you also might want to mention this and that kind of thing. But he was one of the early interviews that I did.
Is there anyone on your bucket list that you hope?
Oh yeah, there's a lot of people on my.
Give me two or three that would be at the top.
3 bucket lists at the top of wanting to interview. One, Steve Washington. I would love to interview Steve Washington, but I also know that there's a lot of conflicts with groups and factions form, and that might make them not as accessible as others. I also would like to interview Patrice Rushen, who's also a musical genius, multi-instrumentalist,
Prodigy. Yeah, all that.
And, some of these folks I've done unsungs. I've been on her unsung, but I never got to meet her. And man, that would be really incredible, because I think that, with women and music and popular music, their genius is often overlooked. And if you amplify what she's done coming out of jazz and doing all the different things she's done, people would really get a lot out of it. And I would learn a lot from speaking with her. Trying to think of someone else that would be one of these people that really answer some big questions I have. Some people, there's just a lot of interviews already, so it takes the intensity out of it. You know what I mean?
Right. Yeah.
But you said one of them already, and there's no way out of it. if you can interview Stevie Wonder, you walking on water. I'm sorry. That's just there's no way around that. You can try to say, well, no, you got if you get a chance, if either of us get to interview Stevie, if you get to interview Stevie Wonder, you need to call me, Scott. You need to say, hey man, I'm talking to your bucket list. All right, because Stevie Wonder, I mean, you would just learn so much just from the way that he has to interpret music and his sense of expression, all of that. They would literally have to put a time limit on the interview to stop me. They'd have to stop me because I wouldn't stop. I would stay with him until I fall out.
As you know, lofty as he is, I don't recall seeing an interview that really digs into from him the musicality and the creative elements behind his masterworks.
I want to talk to him about even works that weren't really well received, like The Secret Life of Plants. Like, what's going through your head and how are you getting to that place of sound, for something that is so heavily visual? Man, please. Yeah, those three would do me well.
Well, let's hope before it's said and done. Well, I've not met her, but I had Patrice on my show, which was
wonderful.
That was awesome.
You did? Oh, you did have her on?
Yeah.
Episode. I'm gonna watch it.
Yeah, she was great.
Wow.
And just so, again, one of those people that just is so down to earth and so easy to communicate with.
Yeah, you love that about people who they could be as pretentious. They have the right to be pretentious, but it's not their choice because that's not who they are, right? Like you would excuse it for certain levels of talent. You just have to get through whatever personality quirks just because they are who they are. And then you meet people that are just genuinely cool people. That's what I was saying about Morris Day, which was really interesting, that he was just, he was the most laid back person in the room. He's like, hey man, we'll just have to do it this way then. Okay, no problem. I was like, wow, in awe.
I think maybe, though, to some extent, it plays a role when you catch them in their arc of their career. Maybe if someone like Morris, you talked to him during Purple Rain, maybe he would be a lot different,
Yes. And maybe he would be, well, we talked about that in an interview where he said, being that character 24/7 is not sustainable. And so I asked him about that. And so these are the kind of things I think that make people more than what we consume as consumers. But then there are people that, like Stevie Wonder, because he's always dealing with causes and, things in the world that he wants to affect and change. There's no character there. That's his advocacy that we hear also in his music. And that I actually have to move that to the top of the list.
Well, so we're hoping the book comes out next year finally. What else are you up to? Is there anything you'd like to plug with the folks?
Sure. I have an anthem that I'm trying to make. It's not an anthem yet, but I hope you all make it an anthem. Song called King of Love, which is a tribute to Martin Luther King. It has Fred Wesley on the cut as well. And just to show you how things can happen if you have a good interview with someone, Fred Wesley and I also did an interview at that historians conference, ASALH. And we hit it off so well. We stayed in touch, and he heard my song and said, yeah, I got some parts I like. So I asked him if he would consider it. And that I think it's has a lot of potential to stick to the ribs as a song that you hear in the Martin Luther King celebration, along with Happy Birthday. If I get Stevie Wonder to sing on it, then of course that would be the ultimate, right?
There's that connection again.
Yeah, absolutely. And so that song, King of Love, is when it came. But see, the good news about it being tied to the King celebration is that it's always going to be new. I'm going to promote it every year with the same ferocity. And I think it has staying power. So that's another one that I'm working on. And I have a song out now called Mango Drops. And that features Aaron Stevenson on vocals. And it was produced, at least this version of it was produced by a rapper producer named Oheni Savant, who's as great of a music producer as he is rapper, one of the rare people that can do both at a high level. And so those are two things, King of Love and Mango Drops.
And where can people pick those up?
You can pick those up at Spotify, Apple Music, any place that does digital music. The artist name is Dr. Scot Brown, Dr. Scotbrown. That's me. And those are two jams that would, I think, really speak well to whatever vibe you're in. The third one is called Serenity, and that features Garfield Bright from the R&B group Shy. And there's a whole, story about our hooking up. He's also, contrary to what he probably promotes a lot, he's Dr. Garfield Bright. He's got his PhD in education. And there was a moment when I was doing a presentation at a conference, National Council for Black Studies, and I brought my bass in, and Patrice Chocolate Banks was also on the panel, and we played Thank You for Letting Me Be Myself at an academic conference and had the whole people up, and they were like, what in the world? And so Garfield Bright was in the audience, and he said, brother, I didn't know you could do that with a PhD. I said, yes, you can. You can do whatever you want. And I don't think that conversation inspired him to get the PhD, but he's already in a master's program. But I think it was encouraging, and he and I have been close ever since. So Serenity, King of Love, and Mango Drops. Check them out.
All right, man. And I love just promoting, education and knowledge along with funk and knowledge of the funk,
Yes.
know? Yeah. So, hey, man, it's been a blast. Thank you so much, Scott, and
It's an honor. Thank you for the invitation.